such veteran, a man named Jim Noreen, was a member of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Division of the 101st Airborne. Last night, after visiting this cemetery for one last time, he passed away in his sleep. Jim was gravely ill when he left his home, and he knew that he might not return. But just as he did 65 years ago, he came anyway. May he now rest in peace with the boys he once bled with. And may his family always find solace in the heroism he showed here. In the end, Jim Noreen came back to Normandy for the same reason we all come back. He came for the reason articulated by Howard Hubner, another former paratrooper who is here with us today. When asked why he made the trip, Howard said, "It's important that we tell our stories. It doesn't have to be something big, just a little story about what happened, so people don't forget." So people don't forget.
Forget Howard and his fellow paratroopers? Never. Howard's story is an American dream, and it begins in the northern state of Michigan, in the city of Saginaw. Howard was born into this rough-and-tumble factory city of 60,000 auto workers, lumbermen, and hard-drinking deer hunters during the heart of Prohibition. His family emigrated from Germany in the late 1800s and settled in Saginaw. Ironically, his lineage was 100% German, but the Hubners were 100% American through and through. Saginaw was a tough city of illegal liquor and frequent gunplay as the revenuers broke up scores of stills around the city. Howard grew up in this wild urban scene with 5 brothers and 2 sisters in this community dominated by cars and hunting. By the time he turned 14, Howard was an expert shot with a rifle and perfectly at home in the great out-of-doors. So he was exactly what Uncle Sam was looking for to fill the ranks of the United States Army. As America was brought into World War II in full force, Howard joined the U.S. Army in 1943. He first trained in Camp Custer in Michigan. But when he learned he could earn an extra $50 per month, he joined the paratroopers and was sent to Fort Wheeler and Fort Benning in Georgia. Howard was soon recognized as a sharpshooter with a rifle and proved it by repeatedly winning target competitions. At Fort Benning, the largest and most advanced paratrooper training facility in the world, Howard was assigned the soon-to-be very famous 507th Regiment of the 82nd Airborne Division. Unfortunately, Howard failed to be photographed with his Company C of the 507th. If you look carefully at this Company C photograph, you'll see that Howard is nowhere to be found. Where was he? This mystery was solved by Howard's confession in a letter home to his mother.
January 30th, 1943. Dear Mom, I was not in the Company C photo because I was cooking in the camp kitchen. Sorry, cooks get the best food and I like to eat, so no photo today. Signed, Howard.
Howard was popular in paratrooper training and had many friends. Here we see him in this rare color photo taken at Fort Benning with one of his young friends, both looking so young they could still be in junior high school. While other paratrooper recruits found the training so strenuous that many of them dropped out, Howard actually enjoyed the intense training. In his youth, he often ran many miles a day hunting and chasing rabbits and deer. Paratrooper training to him was much less strenuous than fighting for his dinner against his 5 older brothers or dragging a 200-pound buck deer through the dense and endless woods of northern Michigan. Howard's 507th Parachute Regiment also trained in Colorado, Kansas, and in the Black Hills of South Dakota, which included mountain survival and combat training. This intense preparation made them an elite fighting force capable of totally independent combat, far behind enemy lines. The first training jumps were accomplished without their combat weapons, gear, or equipment. Later, all those items would add up to an additional 100 pounds, almost doubling most men's weights. Having climbed many high hills and trees, Howard was not afraid of heights. Although many of his buddies were terrified of jumping out of an airplane with a parachute, Howard was intrigued by the thought of leaping into nothing but thin air. His letter to his mother after his first training jump expressed his satisfaction with parachute jumping.
March 1st, 1943. Dear Mom, we made our first parachute jump from an aeroplane today. No big deal for me. The other guys were scared, but I was trained, and all that bothered me was how tiny the cars on the road were. They were really tiny. Signed, Howard.
The final training jumps for the 507 were completed with full combat gear, but not nearly the total weight with which they ultimately jumped into Normandy. The full pack training jumps were made at an average altitude of around 700 feet onto level ground in broad daylight. However, on D-Day, the 507 jumped with much heavier equipment at night from an altitude less than 400 feet and under intense enemy flak and machine gun fire. But Howard enjoyed his training. He received free airplane rides, 3 square meals a day, and an extra $50 per month. And after his 5 training jumps, Howard earned his paratrooper wings with flying colors. After the initial jumps and basic training, the 507th left Fort Benning in Georgia and boarded a train headed for Alliance, Nebraska. This is where the unit would spend the next 8 months learning intensive paratrooper, survival, and mountain combat techniques. From this base, their training took them to Colorado and the Black Hills of South Dakota, and then back to Alliance, where there were no barracks ready for them when they arrived. So they erected a tent city to house them for the ensuing months. Having never been farther west than Kalamazoo, Michigan before he joined the Army, Howard had difficulty adjusting to the Nebraska countryside. His letter to his mother explains.
April 18th, 1943. Dear Mom, I'm on the train to Nebraska for more training. There are no towns out here. I see nothing but flat land and 10,000 cattle, and boy do they stink. Other than that, it's really great out here. Signed, Howard.
Howard and the 507th Regiment spent 8 months of further training in Alliance, Nebraska, Colorado, Kansas, and the Black Hills of South Dakota until the winter of 1943. There were additional parachute jumps and survival training procedures which improved the regiment's readiness for the invasion of Fortress Europe. While Howard and the 507th were spending 18 months in their intensive paratrooper training, never having heard a shot fired in anger, the German war machine was fortifying the French coastline as no coast had ever been prepared in the history of warfare. Unlike the mostly inexperienced Allied forces, including Howard's regiment, the German military had already accumulated 5 years of continuous combat experience behind them on all fronts. Hitler chose Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the famed Desert Fox, to lead the German defenders. Howard and the 507th had their work cut out for them. The brutal Nazi occupation of Europe had to end. The world would eventually learn the unprecedented horrors of the German subjugation of uncountable millions of people from the Black Sea to the Atlantic coast, constituting nothing less than mass murder on an epic scale. In addition to the immense fortification and arming of the French coastline, the Germans created an even more effective defensive obstacle by their massive flooding of the French countryside behind the Normandy beaches. This claimed the lives of countless American paratroopers upon landing and escaped detection from Allied intelligence before D-Day.
Je suis de Normandie, tout fan de mon âme, je remercie Noël. Les nuages sombres, ne nous effrayons pas, le courage de nos héros nous gardera libres. Nos cœurs chantent la chanson de liberté dans toute la France, ô héros de notre patrie, ô héros de notre patrie.
By November 3, 1943, the 507th marched in its final review at Alliance before heading east to go to war. The regiment gathered its gear and boarded the train for Camp Shanks, New York. This would be the farthest east of Saginaw, Michigan, Howard had ever traveled in his life. Camp Shanks on the Hudson River was the largest troop processing center in the United States. It would be the last stateside inspection of Howard's regiment and its equipment before heading to Europe. Howard and his 507th would spend only 2 weeks in Camp Shanks preparing for war before leaving down the Hudson on a ferry boat. For many of the paratroopers on board the Hudson ferry, it would be the first and for many the last time they would ever see the New York City skyline. From the ferry, Howard viewed the Statue of Liberty for the first time in his life, which inspired this letter to his mother.
December 1st, 1943. Dear Mom, I was on a ship today and saw the Statue of Liberty. It was really big. France gave it to us. I hope I can come back and see it again. Signed, Howard.
The ferry carried the 507th down the Hudson River and through the Verrazano Narrows, and landed them on the Brooklyn side of the harbor at Fort Hamilton. From here they boarded the steamship RMS Strathnaver, a cruise ship designed to carry a maximum of 1,200 passengers for the 2-week voyage across the Atlantic Ocean to England. It was overcrowded on the Strathnaver since there were over 2,100 paratroopers aboard. It was a horrible 14-day voyage for them, especially for the enlisted men in the lower levels and steerage. The men of the 507th were so angered by the bad conditions and food aboard the ship that they began to refer to the Strathnaver as a slave ship. However, the men tolerated the intolerable conditions all the way to Liverpool and arrived very happy to step forth on dry land. No sooner had the 507th landed in Liverpool than it was ordered to board the Susan B. Anthony Liberty ship for the short voyage to Northern Ireland, where the 507 would encamp in Portrush after landing in Belfast. Fortunately, it was a short trip, and Howard was not required to eat any more mutton, which he and his fellow soldiers learned on this trip to despise. The 507 knew that they would be in for a lot more training in Ireland, and therefore sightseeing was not high on Howard's list.
January 14th, 1944. Dear Mom, I'm in Ireland. The trip across the ocean was terrible. There are no 4-leaf clovers. Nothing is green. It's too cold and windy for anything to grow. And no leprechauns. I've not seen one. Signed, Howard.
The training was endless, in Howard's opinion, and the weather was cold, damp, gray, rainy, and lifeless in Ireland, and there were no close towns for fun and entertainment. Portrush was not considered a fun town. Howard, during the holidays, made a Christmas tree out of aluminum foil from cigarette packs. The 507 in Ireland participated in more jumps and scaling the local cliffs for practice. It was a dreary time for Howard and the 507 in that training in Ireland.
January 31st, 1944. Dear Mom, all there is in Ireland and England is sheep. Everywhere, sheep. That's all I see. Why not a horse or a cow or anything? Just sheep. Sheep make me sick. Signed, Howard.
Finally, in March 1944, relief arrived from the bleak training period in Ireland, and that was over because the 507 was sent back to England. They landed in Glasgow, Scotland, and immediately boarded a train south to their next training area near Nottingham, England. England seemed to Howard to be more interesting than Ireland, and he enjoyed more the training area at Tollerton Hall and the local British pubs and people there. The training became even more intense in England, and the weather improved slightly so that Howard and the 507 could enjoy the outdoor life as they did back in the States. Every Sunday, the British children would bicycle out to the U.S. base and meet up with Howard and his fellow paratroopers, who would share chewing gum and chocolate with them. The 507 now knew that it would not be long before the invasion would begin, and they were amazed at how much solid intelligence they could learn from the local English girls.
April 1st, 1944. Dear Mom, we're in Nottingham, England, and the girls here are beautiful. They love us. They think we're good-looking and rich because we make more money than officers. Signed, Howard.
I remember you.
He and the 507th availed themselves of leave in London, which was a highly prized vacation from their training. Like most of the 507, Howard had never been in a foreign capital before and enjoyed mostly the dance halls where USO shows were presented virtually every evening. On May 28, 1944, the 507 was bused to their final assembly areas near their designated airfields for departure. They knew from their English girlfriends that this was going to be the beginning of the invasion. Howard and his battalion of the 507th were sent to Fullbeck, not far away from Tollerton Hall by bus. Here they were impounded in heavily guarded hangars where there was no access in or out. Security was extremely tight because here is where they would, for the first time, learn of their destination as paratroopers in the invasion. The final training in England was focused on sand tables and maps of the drop zone in Normandy. Equipment was made ready and last plans were memorized. Howard was appalled, however, when they were told that the sand tables would be changed because they learned that the Germans placed a heavily armed unit into the drop zone for his group, and therefore their drop zone would be changed, and new sand tables were to be developed at the last minute.
June 4th, 1944. Dear Mom, something big is going to happen. Don't know what, but they gave us a carton of cigarettes and lots of Hershey's chocolate. Don't know when I'll write again. Signed, Howard.
This would be the largest airborne invasion of all time, even larger than the German air assault on the island of Crete. Totally, there would be 13,000 U.S. paratroopers made up of almost equal numbers of 82nd and 101 airborne troops. They would be transported in 850 C-47 aircraft, each plane carrying 18 paratroopers and 6 ammunition bundles. Each plane would head for Normandy overweight by more than 6,000 pounds. Instead of jumping at training speeds of 90 miles an hour, on D-Day, the 507 would jump at speeds of over 120 miles an hour. On the evening of June 5th, Howard and the 507 knew that this was the night of the invasion. General Eisenhower came to visit both the 101st and the 82nd Airborne troops and wished them well. Howard remembers Eisenhower telling the 507 that they would expect 30% U.S. casualties among the airborne troops. The 507 was supposed to jump into their drop zone west of the Martaret River and secure the Lafayette Causeway and bridge so that the German troops and tanks could not counterattack into the Utah Beach area. Surprisingly enough, of the 850 C-47s, used for the airborne invasion on D-Day, only 21 were shot down or lost in combat.
Through the twilight, through the darkness, hearts on fire with thunder and lightning, down from the heavens, fighting and dying, all for the hope of ending the nightmare. Now their spirits tell their stories, so we never will forget. Never will In the morning came the fury, fire on earth and souls repossessing. But history will forever know that this bright day was won in the darkness. Now their spirits tell their story, so we never will forget.
The 507 drop zone was intended for them to control the highly strategic La Fière Causeway. This was the key to the Allies moving inland, and also it was key to preventing a German counterattack against the beachhead. However, Howard's drop zone, shown by the orange 507 spider patch, was flooded by the Germans, and if he would have landed there, he would have drowned since he could not swim. Instead, Howard's C-47 was grossly off course to the southeast because of the 30-knot winds and the heavy cloud cover, so that when Howard was able to jump, the plane was almost over Utah Beach near the small village of Poopville. This was almost 12 miles away from the intended drop zone near Omphraville. The C-47 was only about 200 feet above the ground when Howard jumped over Poopville, so that his parachute hardly had time to open before he hit the ground in the dark. He cut his chin in the rough landing and landed alone in a field a few hundred feet from a farmhouse occupied by German soldiers.
Dear Mom, I came down in France near Poupeville, a tiny town. Through the dark, I could hear German soldiers talking loudly from a farmhouse. They were very angry sounding. No wonder. We were here to fight. Signed, Howard.
In the dark, over the next 2 hours, Howard was able to make contact with several paratroopers from a different regiment, forming a functioning combat unit. They worked their way through the dark toward Utah Beach to the east, taking and gathering German prisoners along the way.
Dear Mom, I met a few men from the 506th in the dark, and we moved slowly through the hedgerows. By dawn, we could hear the booming of the battleships leading the beach landings. We were very near Utah Beach. We went that way to the beach. Signed, Howard.
The naval and aerial bombardments of Utah Beach were accurate and effective. There were therefore relatively few Allied casualties at the assault on Utah Beach. On Omaha Beach, however, the bombardments were inaccurate, which resulted in far more casualties on Omaha than on any other beach. The Germans had, moreover, fortified Omaha Beach more thoroughly and had more experienced troops there than on Utah or the other beaches. For these reasons, Omaha was the tough one.
Dear Mom, we hid in the hedgerows and did not engage the Germans in force. But by morning we took some German prisoners and marched them down to Utah Beach, where I was in a photo at the head of the column. Signed, Howard.
This rare film footage and still photo actually shows Howard at the head of the column of the German prisoners on Utah Beach.
Dear Mom, one of the German prisoners on Utah Beach wanted us to protect him from the incoming fire. I said to him, "You so-and-so, you guys started this. If you die, we die together." Signed, Howard.
After spending the night of June 6th on Utah Beach, Howard hitched a ride on a Jeep and headed to St. Mary-Glise, seeking other soldiers from his Company C of the 507. Howard went to St. Mary-Glise since it was in the direction of the 507's original drop zone, and he heard that there was substantial fighting going on in the area. There were skirmishes occurring throughout the countryside all the way. In town, Howard found several members of the 507, and they made their way west toward the Lafier Causeway and quickened their pace since they could hear the sounds of cannon and machine gun fire coming from that direction. The fighting at Lafier Causeway had already been fierce before Howard arrived on June 7th. The day before, on June 6th, the Germans had attempted a frontal assault across the causeway from the west toward the Lafier Manor held by the U.S. Army. Private Marcus Heim of the 505 destroyed at least one of the German tanks in that attack. After heavy fighting, the Germans withdrew back across the causeway to the west side of the flooded Meurthe River. They attacked again across the causeway the next day on June 7th. The Americans again drove the Germans back after heavy losses on both sides. Because it was strategically important for both sides, the Lafayette Causeway would become the bloodiest small engagement in the whole European theater. This modern view looks from the east at the Lafayette Manor to the west at Coquigny. The Meurthe River is a small stream traversing under the bridge when not in flood stage. General Gavin's mandate was to attack and overrun the Coquigny positions of the Germans and secure the causeway. By tilting to a southwestward view, we can see the perspective of our intelligence photographs showing the causeway crossing the flooded Meurthe River in June of 1944.
Dear Mom, on June 7th, I found my 507 buddies in a place called Lafayette. Big fight going on here. We need to control this causeway or Utah Beach will be overrun by the Panzer tanks. We had to hold the causeway to protect the invasion. On June 8th, we got our ammunition ready for attack tomorrow. That night, they sent me and my buddies across the river to spy on the Germans and see what arms they had. They had huge weapons and plenty of them. It was hairy. Signed, Howard.
Why Howard volunteered for a dangerous mission through water when he cannot swim remains a military mystery to this day. The mission was to cross the water just off the north side of the causeway after dark on June 8th in order to gain reconnaissance on the Germans as to arms and strength. Howard and two others waded the 500 yards through the ice-cold water and approached the German positions in Coquigny so closely that they could hear conversations among the troops. They saw that the Germans were very well armed and were in greater numbers than they had imagined. Howard admitted later that it was frightening to see how well the enemy had prepared for what appeared to be certainly a major battle in the morning. General Gavin and Colonel Lewis ordered the Americans to attack at daybreak on June 9th by the members of the 325 Glider Regiment. They had crossed the upper ford of the Meurthe River in the dark. The 325 struck southward towards Coquigny at first light from the famous Tim's Orchard, which had been held since D-Day by Lieutenant Colonel Charles Timms and a small group of 507 paratroopers on the west side of the Meurthe River. The American attack started well, but German reinforcements arrived rapidly in the Coquigny Chapel area, and within an hour the attack was stopped and forced back. The 325 was able to avoid total disaster through the heroic rearguard action of Private Charles de Glopper, who sacrificed his own life to guard the retreat of the 325 back to Tim's Orchard. For this, Private de Glopper was awarded the only Congressional Medal of Honor given in the Normandy campaign to a member of the 82nd Airborne. After the German opening bombardment began the day of fighting, Gavin and Lewis again ordered what was left of the 325 Glider Regiment to initiate a frontal attack across the 1,500 feet of open causeway in an attempt to preemptively take the Germans before their inevitable advance. The 325 was shredded in this attempt, but attained a tenuous foothold on the west end of the causeway. Captain Sauls and his men could not hold this for long. From General Gavin's perspective at the Lafayette Manor, the Sauls attack had failed or at best stalled. Sauls needed help immediately and was in desperate straits on the west end of the causeway, running low on ammunition and with no support in sight. Since the 325 glider had been decimated in the previous attacks, All Gavin and Lewis had left were members of the 507 and a few assorted other units who had assembled quickly into a unified fighting force. Then a Sherman tank was sent out, which proved to be a tactical error since it hit a mine and was disabled, blocking the way for the troop. It was a moment of crisis for General Gavin, who then turned to Captain Bob Ray and said, "You'll have to go." Captain Ray, Howard Huebner, and a group of about 90 members of the 507 thereupon charged across the causeway, dislodged the Germans, overran their positions, and reinforced the 325. Captain Ray, Howard, and the 507 ran screaming, yelling, and shooting across the causeway to victory.
I will. I'm gonna go find my camera.
Would you mind signing?
Yeah, boy,
I have hard sign here. I don't
American.
Oh, okay. Of course.
Some people call me a hero. Well, I'm no hero. The heroes are the boys who landed with me, who lost their lives earning that victory, and who couldn't come home.